So good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Cable from the Accounting Services Division of the Auditor General's Office. This webinar is the second in a series of webinars on information technology controls that our office is presenting for school districts. The slides for this webinar are posted on our website at azauditor.gov under the Reports and Publications for School Districts in the Webinars tab. We also provided a link to our website in the reminder email that you received for today's webinar. Also, if you're having any trouble hearing me right now through your computer, you can call into the webinar at the phone number provided in the reminder email for a clearer connection, perhaps. We did reserve an hour and a half for this webinar to allow time for your questions, but as we don't know exactly how many questions you might have, we may be able to end a bit early. Speaking of your questions, you can use the window in the right of your screen to type your questions at any time. If we don't stop to cover your question immediately when we see it, we'll get to it at the end of the session. Or perhaps if your question is fairly district specific or we need to discuss the issue with you more in order to ensure we give you the best answer possible, we'll contact you after the webinar. If we do go the full time and you need to leave early, don't worry about missing important information as this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website along with a timed outline to help you access any information that you may miss or allow you to simply refer back to information covered today in the future. That also means that recording will be available for you to share information from this webinar with others at your district that may not have been able to attend today. Presenting with me today is Jenny Snediger from our Division of School Audits. Jenny is an experienced lead auditor in our school district performance audits, and she specializes in the IT control evaluation that our office does as part of those audits. In today's webinar, we'll focus on identifying users and limiting access to district systems. All of the topics for this series of IT webinars are related to areas that our office has identified either through the compliance questionnaires completed by your financial auditors or through our own performance audits as areas that districts can make improvements to better secure their networks and accounting and student information systems. Throughout the webinar today, we'll refer to policies and procedures at different times. And it's important for your district to have well-documented policies that relate to the procedures in place to protect your IT resources. Sometimes Jenny or I might just say policies or procedures, but keep in mind that it may be either your policies or procedures that need attention to ensure a strong IT control environment. Let's take a little closer look at what we're covering in the webinar today. As I previously mentioned, our office saw an opportunity in the findings noted by your auditors to assist districts by providing resources to help you ensure that you have appropriate controls in place over IT to protect and ensure the integrity of your data. Today, we'll be discussing identifying system users, establishing roles and responsibilities, the controls that you need to have in place to limit access to IT systems and resources, and the importance of monitoring to ensure that controls are working to secure your IT systems and resources. Keep in mind that this webinar is designed for both IT and business office employees, so while there may be some IT lingo as we go through, we'll try to keep it all understandable for even non-IT oriented folks. Speaking of lingo, before we get into today's topic, I wanted to take a brief moment to refresh everyone on some of the terms that we used in the last webinar and we'll be using again today to make sure we're all on the same page. Although many districts will have similar employee positions that are involved in the development and implementation of their IT systems, we know that those employees may not always have the same job title. Some districts may have a director of IT operations, while others may have a less formal IT coordinator, Or maybe you just have that go-to IT guy or gal at your district. So these definitions will help clarify who we mean as we discuss the people and departments involved in establishing and implementing the IT controls. So when we talk about IT, we mean an information technology department with personnel that are generally led by a director who has the ultimate authority within their department. IT personnel should be responsible for setting and controlling user access rights within a system. Many people would refer to them as system administrators. To maintain the integrity of your operations, these system administrators should not be end users on your systems, and those because they have too much control. However, they should have that control and ability to assign system access for users based on guidance from the applicable system managers. So that brings us to system managers, who are generally the highest supervisory level user of a system, and they determine what user access should be for all users in the system. Now, I said they determine it. They don't actually establish it in the system. For example, a business manager could be the system manager for an accounting system. As the system manager is a user of the system, that manager should not have the ability to set those roles and access within the system. They have the responsibility of understanding what users need to access in the system and communicating that to IT so that IT can retain the appropriate responsibility of actually setting the user access in the system. Finally, on the slide, we have decision makers. Generally, that's your governing board, superintendent, or other executive district level administrator who has the authority to approve and implement any given policy, process, or project within a school district, and who is accountable for the outcome. So now that we're all on the same page with those terms, let's refresh our memories briefly as to what IT controls are and why they're important. What do we mean by IT controls? They are defined measures taken to minimize risk and ensure business objectives are being met. They help protect your systems and data against loss. They also protect against unauthorized access and can even protect against theft and fraud. We know that to non-IT personnel, IT controls can seem confusing. And unfortunately, there isn't a magical compliance checklist of exactly the controls you need to have for IT. But there are many IT standards and practices that you can choose from and ensure that you have the right controls in place at your district. There are also different ways to implement the controls that you determine are best suited to your district. The first webinar in this series that we provided gave information on various resources your district can use to develop and refine your IT controls based on IT standards and best practices. That webinar is on our website if you want to refer back to it at any time in the future. So that's it for the refresher, and I'm going to turn things over to Jenny to start discussing establishing roles and responsibilities.
Thank you, Chris. When you are establishing IT roles and responsibilities, it is important to ensure that clear lines of authority are defined. Who is in charge of what part of the process and why? Clarifying who will be responsible for establishing user access, operating, and monitoring the district's network and systems is an important first step. You need to identify an IT administrator and system manager for each system. The IT administrator manages the system and processes user access requests. Ideally, this administrator should not be a user on the system. This helps to maintain a segregation of duties. For instance, while the business manager would want to identify and decide access appropriateness, an IT staff manager or member should be the one that has the ability to add and manage users. One of the most common problems districts have in their IT system controls is the existence of super users, who, by the nature of their access to the system, are able to bypass any controls otherwise established in the system that could have protected the district's data and resources from unauthorized use. Ask yourself, do we have any super users at our district? For example, is a business manager acting as the IT administrator for the accounting system, as well as entering or approving transactions? If the answer is yes, you need to look at ways to change the roles and responsibilities so that you better secure your district systems by eliminating super users. Once you have an IT administrator determined for each system, next you need to determine who will communicate what access users need to that IT administrator. You need a system manager assigned for each system that can be responsible for identifying other system users and their access needs. To do that, system managers need to know the answers to these questions. What systems do we have? How are these systems used? Who needs access? They may seem like easy questions to answer for those involved with the day-to-day operations, but system managers need to have a thorough understanding of exactly what access people need to do their jobs. System managers need to be able to communicate what they know about user needs in a clear access request for the IT administrator, so that the IT administrator for the system can grant that access in the system. Keep in mind that system managers need to consider not only district employees when answering these questions, but also any third-party vendors that the district may deal with that perform certain functions for the district. No matter who that vendor is, even if it's the vendor that supplied the software for the system and they perform continuing maintenance or update services for the system, they don't need to have full, unlimited access to your district system. If the vendor does need access from time to time, there could be an account that is set up for a vendor but is kept disabled and enabled when necessary. System managers should not be able to actually give the user access within the systems, as system managers are generally users of the system themselves. And if they had the power to change user access in the system, they could change their own access and circumvent the controls in the system without anyone knowing. The first three questions on this slide are important, but don't forget that a system manager needs to consider the answer to the last question: what do they need to do in the system to determine what level of access to information and processes each user should be given. Once your IT organizational structure is in place, you need to ensure that your district has policies and procedures that describe the process for granting access and monitoring access to ensure that IT systems and resources are secure. These policies and procedures need to address establishing access for employees as well as third parties, such as software contractors or other vendors the district uses in providing its IT systems. This would include documentation explaining the role definitions so roles will be applied consistently and that everyone knows what those roles mean. How HR and personnel and system managers will communicate employee changes such as new hires, terminations, and job duty changes to the appropriate IT personnel so that they can effectively maintain the users on the different systems. Technology user agreements should be developed, utilized, and maintained for each employee and/or third-party contractor to ensure that they understand the district's IT policies and any personnel or contract actions that could result from failing to follow the district IT policies. Lastly, district policies and procedures need to address how changes in the system access will be approved by district administration and system administrators to provide a check and balance in the process of establishing user access. All changes made by IT administrators should be based on documented requests from system managers, and system managers should review granted access periodically and when changes are made to help ensure that only appropriate authorized access is given to district systems and data.
You know, Jenny, it's a really great point to make that in our districts, we often know and understand how these processes are going, how information is coming from one person to another, but sometimes fall short in remembering to document that process, to have the defined process set up so that everyone knows and understands how that information is supposed to be communicated.
That's true. Thank you, Chris, for pointing that out. Now that we have covered establishing policies and procedures that define the roles and responsibilities for determining and granting user access, we can begin looking at the actual controls used to restrict user access. Your district's policies and procedures should address how access will be restricted and monitored. There are two types of access controls to address in your district's policies and procedures. Logical access controls are ones that involve system or software mechanisms that limit user access, such as requiring passwords to be used to gain access to systems or data. And physical access controls, those that include that restrict the entry and exit of personnel and often equipment and media to and from a physical area, such as a building or room containing critical computer-related equipment, such as network servers, routers, and switches. Controls over physical access include barriers that isolate areas like locked doors that require a key or passcode. Monitoring is a critical part of establishing any access control. The access controls established to secure systems and data are only as strong as the process used to ensure that those controls are actually in place and restricting access as intended. Districts need to have policies and procedures that ensure such monitoring is occurring. One way of monitoring access controls is regular generation and review of access logs or reports so that any inappropriate access can be detected and controls strengthened or adjusted to eliminate threats to your system. Once you have defined processes for assigning, documenting, and monitoring user access, it's time to think about the access that you are actually giving to each user. When setting up user access, it is important to give users all of the access they need to do their jobs, but no more than they need. That is where the concept of least privilege comes in. Under the concept of least privilege, users are given just the access they need to do their assigned jobs, no more and no less. In determining what the least privilege should be for a user, system managers should ask themselves a couple of more specific questions about user needs. What data do they need to do their job? What do they need to do with that data? Let those answers determine the data they are given access to and the abilities they are granted in regard to creating, modifying, and deleting that data. For example, in IT systems, users can be given access to create new records, approve or alter already existing records, view and even delete records. But generally, to ensure appropriate separation of responsibilities, no one employee should be given access to do all of these things. If their job duties are assigned with segregation of duties in mind, they won't need the ability to do all of these things to do their job. So that brings up an important point. Once you know what data a user will need and what they need to be able to do with that data, you need to stop and consider one more thing before granting access to that data and those processes. You need to consider if giving that access will cause issues with appropriate segregation of duties. In accounting terms, this means that responsibilities for authorization, record keeping, and custody should be separated. In other types of IT systems, the triangle we just reviewed on the last slide may be more applicable if you need to separate the ability to create, modify, and approve records. Let's take a look at an example in an accounting system. Giving one person access that would allow them to process a payment in the accounting system from beginning to end without anyone else being involved creates a risk that inappropriate payments could be made. If you have a user that you think needs all of this access or any set of access that makes a problem for adequate segregation of duties, you need to take a hard look at how that user's job responsibilities could change or if they could still do their job with less access. The most common problem we see related to system access and segregation of duties is a lack of care taken in establishing user access so that someone who really only needed to view certain information to do their job was actually given access to modify that information in the system. Taking the time to ensure the proper level of access when access is first granted can save you many headaches down the road. If, however, you can't find a way to reduce the employee's need for access to incompatible processes in the system, you will need to establish compensating controls, generally outside of the system through the form of required reviews to address the excessive access the user has within the system. One last point worth making about what you give users access to is that you need to consider the classification of the data you are granting access to and the related security concerns that need to be taken into consideration. We talked about classifying data and protecting sensitive data in the first webinar of this series, so you can always refer back to that session if you want to refresh yourself on those issues. Although segregation of duties is the key, you can determine if the most effective way for your district to set up employee user access is by role-based settings or employee-specific settings. Role-based settings can be used when there is more than one person in a similar role and they will have similar needs in the system. In that case, using role-based settings can be a quicker way to create and assign access for users based on generic settings already in the system. However, it is important to be careful that the time saved in using role-based settings does not lead to giving users unnecessary access in the system. Employee-specific settings are created each time an employee is added to the system and would be appropriate to use when few people or maybe only one person fills that specific role at your district. This method recognizes that most often each employee has different needs for access in the system. While this process can take more time to set up because there are no canned or preset profiles in the system to simply activate, the extra time spent can help you ensure that you know the access given to the user is appropriate. Both methods of assigning access are acceptable, but one thing to keep in mind is that either way you establish the user access, it's never a good idea to set it and forget it. You need to be sure that the role-based settings are accurate for the job the person will perform. Don't rely on a job title to feel good about the access someone needs, especially not job titles that come with suggested access assignments preset in a system. For example, not all accounting clerks need the same access just because they have the same job title. There really isn't a similar option when it comes to establishing access for third parties, such as the county school superintendent or vendors that your district has contracted with to perform some work for one or more of your systems, such as maintenance, oversight, or both. To set user access for third parties, you need to analyze the specific relationship you have with that third party. Who from the third party will have access? What access do they need? What services will they provide? And most importantly, how will district data be protected? Remember, you will want all of these concerns spelled out in the contract or written agreement you have with the third party to ensure both the district and the third party understand their responsibilities and liabilities when it comes to securing district systems. Similar to those agreements or contracts entered into with third parties, you need to ensure that district employees fully understand district policies and procedures for the appropriate use of district data and IT resources. User agreements are a good way to set parameters on what should and should not be done with district property, including data. These policies should encompass but should not be limited to the use of district computers, adding and deleting information on the network, how the district's information should be utilized by employees, maintaining confidentiality of the district's sensitive data, outlining what the district considers to be lawful versus unlawful use of the district's technology, and last, how these policies will be enforced. keep in mind that if you ever want to revise and or update these policies, then a new user agreement will need to be signed by each employee. Whether setting employee or third-party user access, generally user access can be controlled at 4 different levels. First, at the network level. The network administrator helps establish a user ID and password to log on to the system. Next, at the local workstation level, users can be required to lock their computers while they are away from their workstation. Then, at the application level, additional user authentication can be required. Specifically, the district's accounting software and student information systems will often have their own user ID and passwords that must be used to access those applications. And finally, at the level of the database, which houses sensitive information or a specific file that contains sensitive information, user restrictions should be established as needed at this level in order to maintain the integrity of the data contained in these databases and files. In addition to these 4 levels where access can be controlled, there are different ways to authenticate users and monitor access. In the next few slides, we will cover ensuring strong controls over user authentication through user ID and password setup and other controls that can be in place to provide barriers to unauthorized personnel accessing district systems. Finally, we will talk about monitoring the controls you have in place to ensure they are effective and up to date. User activity logs are a good way for administrators to monitor whether any unauthorized activity or changes to critical applications or systems have occurred. This includes monitoring the activities of administrative users or users with full access to critical systems or applications. At each electronic system access point, users should have to authenticate themselves with a user ID and password. There are several things to consider when establishing user IDs and passwords. First, it should be the IT administrator's role to create user accounts for the applications, and users should be required to change the password upon initial login or in order to maintain the user ID's integrity. Second, when IT administrators create user IDs, they should ensure that they are unique to the user and that only one user ID is issued per employee. Username should also be identifiable to the user. So you should not have general accounts such as admin user. Those types of accounts are easy to guess, and by their nature, they are used by more than one user or they wouldn't serve any purpose. Many systems come with a preset ID like this, but it should be removed after the initial system setup is completed and before the system is placed into service. This removes the possibility of confusion that could occur when a generic user ID is utilized and you cannot identify what user was on the system. In addition to strong controls over user IDs and passwords to authenticate system users, you should take other measures to limit access to your district systems that can be as easy as locking a door or logging who enters an area. Think about your district for a minute. What areas should be restricted access only to ensure that people that don't need access to your system don't have access? Does everyone in your district need access to all work areas? Probably not. There are some areas that very few people need access to, like your server room. So what about your server room? Is the room locked? Who can access the room? Is it on the master key? Who has a master key? We often see that maintenance staff have master keys, but your maintenance staff doesn't need access to the computer room. Are key fobs used to provide a way to monitor access? They provide an electronic trail that you don't get with a simple key. While it isn't exactly related to securing access to your server room, you want to make sure that you have good climate and emergency controls in place for the server room as listed here. After all, if the server room is too warm, it isn't a good long-term option to just prop open the door to keep it cool. There are other areas in your district that many people need to have access to. School and district offices have employee work areas that are not separated by doors, that can be locked, or in many cases, there are no doors between work areas. Think cubicle land. So in these more accessible areas, it is important to secure the computers themselves. Users should be trained to lock computers when not in use. But because users are human and mistakes happen, computers should also be set to time out after a specific period of non-use. And of course, passwords should not be shared or openly posted. User activity logs are a good way for an administrator to monitor whether any unauthorized activity or changes to critical applications or systems have occurred. This includes monitoring the activities of administrative users or users with full access to critical systems or applications. Proper monitoring can help a district be proactive and address potential threats and other issues before harm occurs. Logging and monitoring are essential to assuring the integrity of district data. Logging involves keeping a record of changes and actions related to the district's network and computer systems. Monitoring involves timely reviewing of log activities that a district deems important to ensure actions being performed are appropriate. Due to the nature of IT systems, logs can quickly become unmanageable in length. As a result, a district should determine the key activities or critical IT events and areas to log and monitor, such as those affecting security, availability, and appropriate use of its computer systems and other resources. Once the district has identified what data is sensitive and what actions it is most concerned about, such as unauthorized users accessing the network, it should log and monitor these events and follow up when something occurs that requires attention. The district should review these logs on a regular basis to ensure appropriate actions are taken to resolve issues identified. Some organizations find it helpful to develop or acquire software to help them to correlate, monitor, alert, and report on the events they decide to log. IT should generally be responsible for logging and monitoring efforts. However, it is also important for system managers to be accountable for identifying those key activities that should be monitored, such as activities that do not have a compensating control elsewhere or that pose a segregation of duties issue. System managers should also monitor logged activity reports to help ensure that activities are appropriate and follow up and remediate any questionable activities if necessary. So why do we care about monitoring user access and activity? Monitoring reports and logs provide a clear audit trail, identifying what happened, when, and by whom. We care about reviewing these monitoring logs and reports because it allows us to provide accountability, and it's a detective control. When activity is monitored and reviewed, you can hold individuals responsible for their actions. Without monitoring, you might recognize a problem exists, but not be able to see who is causing the problem. With proper monitoring in place, you can readily look for and identify malicious activity. Reviewing monitoring reports and logs is also a corrective control. Beyond identifying the problem, it can help you fully understand the nature and extent of the problem and get the clear picture needed to properly fix it. Determine what needs to be reviewed when monitoring user access. The main focus of monitoring for user access is to ensure segregation of duties and that changes to user access have been made appropriately when needed. For example, when employees leave the district or change job functions. Just ensuring that monitoring logs or reports exist is the first step, but those logs and reports need to be reviewed periodically to actually ensure that segregation of duties is maintained and that access is actually what you think it is in your systems. When reviewing user access logs for reasonableness, look at the time when the user accessed the system. Does it seem appropriate? Also, bear in mind that users should not be reviewing their own logs.
That's some great information, Jenny. So just to recap that guidance that Jenny has already reviewed, we have some basic do's and don'ts that you'll want to keep in mind. You do, of course, want to set user access based on job needs, using the concept of least privileges. So that means you don't want to be automatically using default access that's set in software packages or maybe set by a vendor. That can be a real risk for you. Those vendors and those software packages, they don't know your individual user's needs like you do. You do, of course, want to be using unique IDs and complex passwords to help secure your systems. And you don't want to be using generic IDs or admin type of user IDs in your system once it's up and running. I know those admin IDs are often there at the beginning, but they need to be out, completely removed when you're actually operating the system. Whoever would have used that admin ID needs to be using their own ID to do whatever they need to do in the system. That creates that audit trail. You also want to limit generic vendor or super users to only what's necessary. So I would love to say you'll never have a need to have any kind of super user, but occasionally I think we've seen people come up with a pretty good argument for temporary needs of a super user. But for the most part, you need to be making sure that super users aren't in your system or that they're really, really well monitored to make sure that they're not doing, well, what they've got the power to do, which is anything. You need to, of course, be reevaluating user access when job responsibilities change. It's really easy to just add on new access for a user and forget to take away access that they may no longer need based on the change in their job. But that little extra time spent ensuring they only have the access they need will pay off in the end. You do need to monitor key activity of users, especially if you have some super users. So as Jenny said earlier, you definitely don't want to set it and forget it. You need to be involved in the process throughout, ensuring that your users always have only the access they need. You do, of course, want to restrict access to your servers and work areas. It's not appropriate to just let anyone walk up to your server in your server room or even a live terminal anywhere in your district. And I know it can be a challenge to get employees to lock those computers when they're not in use, but that's where having your system lock those computers as a backup for our own human forgetfulness is appropriate. Finally, shutting down unused ports throughout your district, that's something that I can see really easily forgotten. You might have a conference room that had a port put into it in the first place, and it may sometimes come in handy to have a port there for computer users, but that port shouldn't be live all of the time if that conference room is subject to people who shouldn't have access to your system coming into that room. Having cubicles that aren't in use right now, having a live port in those cubicles presents a risk that someone can come and plug into your system. And it's just not worth that risk for the little bit of convenience that having that unused port might make it slightly quicker to expand when you add an employee later. So knowing what you should do is one thing, but the hard part is taking what you know you should do and putting it into action. Even if you know that there is work to be done in your policies and procedures to get them into shape, you may still be thinking, okay, sure, but where should I start? You can start by asking yourself a few questions. Does your district have any super users? If so, that's definitely the first place to start. Super users can circumvent any system and control that you have in place and be able to effectively hide their tracks as well. So getting rid of super users by ensuring that no system user is given the ability to set access goes a long way to securing your system. You can ask yourself, are job responsibilities separated to ensure that no one person has complete control over a transaction cycle? Or do personnel have access to more data or processes than they need to do their jobs? Even if you don't have any super users, you may have people with too much access, more than they really need. So you need to focus on fixing those issues to improve your controls as well. So that concludes the information that we prepared for today's webinar, but I wanted to take a moment as we wait to see if you have any questions that you still want to submit to us, to remind you that the information we shared with you today is based on IT standards and best practices, and that you can refer for help in establishing your own district's policies and procedures to those standards and best practices. But if these acronyms on the screen aren't looking terribly familiar to you, remember that we reviewed each of these IT resources in our first IT webinar. And I'd also like to take a minute to let you know that our next IT webinars will address network controls and disaster recovery. So be sure to look for invitations for those webinars in 2015. Also, on our website, you can find IT FAQs with some great information about setting user roles and responsibilities, as well as the Uniform System of Financial Records for School Districts that contains useful information on separating accounting-related responsibilities, and it has an IT section with basic information on establishing IT controls. So let's see what questions have come in for us so far. Anything? We had a couple that came in that we've responded back to privately. They were just a little bit of reiterations here and there. If there are any other questions that you have, we'll allow a couple minutes for people to go ahead and submit those now. Well, you may be typing frantically. If you're not, then I would point out that, of course, any questions that you have after today can be directed to us through the contact information that's on your screen. You can reach us by phone or by email. That email address that's up there gets you to my group in the Accounting Services Division, but rest assured that if you have questions that exceed our expertise on IT, we will help you find the right resource or information. Someone is asking whether or not the slides will be available, and they are currently available on our website under the webinars for school districts. And this session, of course, is going to be recorded so that it will also be available in the future. So another question that came in, and I totally understand why, is IT folks, are they the only ones who's supposed to be super users? Now, I think that's just one of those little misconceptions related to what one means when you say user of a system. Yes, you have IT people who will be involved in administering your system. They grant access for users within the system, but they should not be a user of the system. So if you talk about your accounting system, your IT administrator should not have the role at all to do anything within the accounting system other than granting access. They shouldn't be ever preparing a PO or authorizing a PO or allowing a payment to be processed. The idea is keeping those two functions completely separate. IT is then system users, completely separate. Another great question is whether or not a computer auto lock policy is required by law. So, you know, statute doesn't address absolutely everything that would be a good control for school districts to have, and IT best practices certainly do address the idea of keeping your computer systems secure. There's often times throughout your basic policies and procedures that you're going well beyond what's required by law because it's a good business practice, because it's the right thing to be doing to secure that sensitive information that you have in your systems. And I can certainly understand the person who asked that question is saying, darn, that's too bad. It would actually be great if it was in the law because it would be more enforced. And I understand that from an IT perspective. IT personnel are often the bearers of bad news to the employees at their district, trying to help them to understand the importance of the controls that need to be in place. If you get a lot of resistance, perhaps they need to listen in on the webinar, and it will be up on the website for their future reference. We do, of course, appreciate all of your diligence in helping your districts understand these requirements. So there was one more question about super users and the fact that they're always built into systems and how we suggest that they get locked down so that somebody has that super access but is not causing an issue when it comes to the actual operation of the system. And I know that a person who's able to establish access in a system clearly has the ability to give themselves access in that system. But that's what they're not supposed to be doing. They shouldn't be giving themselves access to do other user-type roles in that system, and that's where monitoring comes in. You can't really protect against whether a super user gives themselves more access than they should have. And I hate to call them a super user. They're really the IT administrator for that system. You can't protect against them giving themselves extra access if you're not looking. You have to be monitoring who has access to critical parts in your system in general, who has access, and is that the right access at all times. That's where, again, that IT system, the IT administrator is not the person who should be reviewing those monitoring logs for access. That really should be the system manager and perhaps other people completely independent of the system as well, so that there's good checks and balances in place to ensure that only proper access in your system is granted. Great question. It looks like we've reached the end of your great questions, though. So remember, like I said, you can, of course, contact us by phone or by email, and these resources will be posted on our website. The slides are there now, the recorded webinar probably within the next week or so. Thanks again very much for attending, and we look forward to attending our future IT webinars after the beginning of the year. Have a great day.